I remember the first time I came to Houston was 1982. I was working as a reservoir engineer, petroleum engineer for Texaco on Canal Street in New Orleans. And they brought me over here to attend a reservoir engineering school put on by Slip Slider. And some of you older gray hairs in the audience may remember that name back from the 1980s. But there's a reason why I'm not a petroleum engineer today, and that's because oil prices collapsed, there wasn't anything going on. And so I'm thinking, this might be a good time to go back to graduate school and do something else. So here I am, and I'm starting out that way by saying we've been through this before. As Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And I'm going to put another old saying on top of that, and thinking about how this is rhyming. The other one is an even older saying that we never cross the same river twice. So even though we've been through this dance before, it is a little different. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to focus on the U.S. economy and talk about the support coming to the region, both in terms of economic support from demand from the non-energy space supporting the Houston economy, and also from the energy space. So I'm going to have a very broad discussion, and then we're going to get into the real experts here on energy after myself. So I'm going to give you a view on the U.S. economy that's very consumer-centric. The title of the talk that I've been given this year is really U.S. consumers versus the world. And consumer spending is 2/3 of GDP, so essentially as consumer spending goes, so does gross domestic product. And we think about the forces on U.S. households right now, and that is a key determinant of petroleum demand. Downside forces in the red oval on top, global capacity overhang. Well, you're living that in Houston right now with too much oil out there sloshing around. Not only oil, but virtually every other commodity. Huge amount of excess capacity in steel production in China and so forth and so on. So we're living that here, ground zero in Houston. The strong dollar, another issue, as due to the desynchronization of global central bank policy. Those are graduate school words I like to throw out there. I mean, central banks are doing different things. Quantitative easing, negative interest rates in Europe and Japan and other places. And what's that is doing? That's putting upward pressure on the dollar. So if you're General Electric and you're trying to export locomotives and big machinery and Caterpillar and farmers, agricultural products, your products are now 20–25% more expensive compared to competitors than they were a couple of years ago, and that's putting some back pressure on you, and we're seeing that in the manufacturing sector in the U.S. Internationally, China is a big deal. As we all know, when we get better than expected economic news out of China, oil prices go up. Worse than expected news out of China, oil prices go down. China is about on par with the U.S. in terms of the size of the economy, but they're leading, in terms of large economies, they're leading growth. So half the growth, half the economic growth in the world comes from China, and that's why they're a big deal. Europe, a little bit larger together, Europe a little bit larger than the U.S. and China. And we've gone through several scares in Europe. One was Brexit, the potential for Greece leaving the Eurozone, but I think a much bigger deal and a much more potential volatility inducer to global financial markets is Brexit. The potential for the UK, Great Britain, to leave the Eurozone, a major pillar of Europe, and it does look like that leave vote that's scheduled for June 23rd is starting to gain some momentum right now, and I think that does add a lot of volatility, and perhaps it does change the Eurozone way of thinking. Maybe they're no longer the Hotel California, right, where you can check in but you can't check out. Greece couldn't check out, but maybe Great Britain does, and that paves the way for other countries, Czech Republic, maybe some others to leave as well. So I think a destabilizing event there. What's going on right for U.S. households, though? Job growth, first and foremost, over 200,000 jobs created on average for the last couple of years. Wages are coming up, but even moreover than job growth, house prices. Now, Houston is going to be a different kettle of fish in this market, but on the U.S. overall, house prices are up 5%. Homeowners are gaining equity in their homes again. They're not leveraged. So things are going pretty well for the U.S. household. Confidence is coming up. And low energy prices, we don't like to hear this here in Texas, but low energy prices putting a lot of money out into the hands of consumers. It is time to load the kids up in the station wagon, the brand new SUV you bought, and drive to Disneyland. Florida is doing very, very well. So that's the story with consumers right now. And this graph, this has really been my favorite graph for the last couple of years. It really gets into these issues. And I'll just go through these slides very, very quickly here. The orange line is a household obligations ratio. Think about that as consumer leverage. Leverage was ramping up in the 90s into the 2000s. We were financing the snowmobile, the blender, the 3 BMWs in the driveway. We go through the massive deleveraging process into 2010 and 2011. That is a very painful part of US economic history, the foreclosure crisis, right? Because when you get foreclosed on, you get delevered whether you want to be or not. The good news is we're bottoming out at a very low level of household leverage. And so a lot of potential for upside to bring an appropriate amount of credit on back. And we're starting to see some more credit instruments to bring first-time home buyers into the market. The blue line here is the savings rate, the personal savings rate, declining through the 2000s. We didn't need to save a lot of money when house prices were going up 10, 15% a year forever and ever and ever. At least that's what we thought in 2005. We learned that wasn't true. The savings rate spikes up, which is good for households, but for every dollar I save is a dollar I don't spend, so it comes right out of consumer spending. The good news in this story is the savings rate stabilizing 5 to 5.5%. It doesn't need to come up anymore because we are generating income or wealth on the houses. I think both those lines are very, very good news for US consumer spending. It's piling on that a little bit. The orange line here, household net worth, clearly above the pre-recession peak. There's distributional issues within that. All the stories you're hearing about the gains in post-recession gains in financial markets accruing to the wealthiest, absolutely true, but total household net worth is coming up, and a big part of that is explained by the blue line there, homeowner equity. We're now about at the pre-recession peak. It's coming up 25, 30% a year. So for most US households, the house, again, is the piggy bank. And it doesn't need to be, the go-go years of 2005 and 6. We're in a pretty good space right now in terms of 5% or so year-over-year gains on housing with very low mortgage rates. One of the chief engines, as I mentioned, job growth. The blue lines here are month-to-month job growth, about 200,000 per month, bringing the unemployment rate down. Unemployment rate's the green line here. I do think it continues to drop below the 4.9% we had in February. It's going to drop at a slower rate. We're asymptotically approaching that lower bound here. Maybe we get down to 4.6, 4.7, 4.5 if you're an optimist. But it does mean the job markets are tightening up, and we're going to start to see some wider spread wage gains going forward. Federal Reserve looking at these wage gains, expecting oil prices to come back a little bit, anticipating some inflation. I do expect the Fed to follow through on the just released dot plot, which shows the FOMC, the voting and non-voting members' expectations going forward of interest rate increases. My expectation is we get another 25 basis point increase in June, one more in December, and then a gradual increase after that, bringing long rates up. So the era of ultra cheap money is coming to an end. It doesn't mean it gets expensive. It means we're at a bottoming out point. US monetary policy tightening up interest rates. Even though Europe is somewhat looser than us, Mario Draghi, the president of the European Central Bank, has already said no more. We are at the apex of easy money in Europe as well. So the global tide is starting to turn. Even though the Fed's been well ahead of other central banks, we can see that shift in the discussion there. Finally, coming back to the GDP story, the overall US economy, even though we're looking at moderate interest rate increases, I think we can keep the job machine going. The last data point there on the right, the blue bar, was the fourth quarter, very weak growth, about 1% for the fourth quarter of last year. I'm expecting a little bit better for the soon-to-be completed first quarter this year, and then back up to trend growth, about 2 to 2.5% if we're lucky, getting into early next year. That will be enough to keep demand going in the US. I think Europe continues to expand. China probably falling below their target, but expanding. at a slower rate. One more point that I can make while I'm on this graph is look at the second half of 2012. Those barely visible lines in the second half of 2012, very, very weak GDP growth. Did you hear about the recession of 2012? We were almost there. The reason why we weren't there is the energy sector. That was drill, baby, drill, a lot going on, and that was one of the good sides of the energy sector over the last couple of years, really supporting a weak US expansion that otherwise could have turned the other way. Now, I'm going to conclude my remarks there and pass it on to Dave.